You took everything from me.
She endured the unthinkable in silence until the night silence broke. What she did next was not just revenge, it was a line drawn that no one would ever cross again. Welcome to Shadows of Black History. If you are new to this channel, take a moment to subscribe and like our videos so you never miss the hidden stories that shape the past. We truly appreciate every single one of you who watches and supports this journey into the forgotten corners of history. Tonight's story is one you will not want to miss even a single paragraph of. Stay with us until the very end, because this is a story of pain, courage, and a mother's love that refused to be broken. So relax, settle in, and let us begin. The plantation stood quiet beneath the weight of the southern sun, its wide fields stretching endlessly as if the land itself had surrendered to control. In the early 1800s, places like this were built on silence. Not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the kind forced into existence by fear. Every movement was watched, every word measured, every life controlled by a system that decided who could speak and who must endure. Among those living within that system was a woman named Eliza, known to others not for loudness or defiance, but for her quiet strength. She worked in the fields from sunrise to dusk, her hands hardened by labor, her back marked by years of survival. But beyond everything else, she was a mother, and that was the one role that shaped every decision she made. Her daughter, Lila, was young, just beginning to understand the world around her, though that world offered her little kindness. Eliza did everything she could to protect her, teaching her when to stay silent, when to avoid certain paths, when to keep her eyes low and her movements careful. It was a fragile protection, one that could be broken at any moment, but it was all she had. The plantation owner, a man who rarely worked but controlled everything, carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he could take whatever he wanted without consequence. And for years, that belief had never been challenged. The people under his control had learned to avoid his attention, because attention often led to suffering that could not be undone. The change came quietly, the way most terrible things do. Eliza noticed it first in the way Lila moved. Slower, more withdrawn, her eyes avoiding contact, her voice softer than before. At first, she thought it was exhaustion, the weight of work settling into a young body not yet used to such demands. But a mother sees what others do not. She noticed the fear, the hesitation, the silence that felt different. One evening, and after the long day had ended and the cabin settled into low murmurs and dim light, Eliza sat beside her daughter and asked gently what was wrong. At first, Lila said nothing. Her hands trembled slightly, her breathing uneven. Then slowly the truth began to emerge. Not all at once, not in clear words, but enough. The master had come. The room felt smaller as the meaning settled in. Eliza did not react immediately. She did not shout. She did not cry. Instead, she became still in a way that was more powerful than any visible reaction. Inside her, something shifted. Not quickly, not violently, but deeply. The kind of shift that changes everything that comes after. She held her daughter close, her hand resting gently against her back, her voice calm even as her thoughts moved into a place she had never allowed them to go before. The system she had endured, the rules she had followed, the silence she had maintained, all of it suddenly felt different. It was no longer just about survival. It was about something that could not be ignored. That night, as the plantation settled into darkness, Eliza did not sleep. She sat in the quiet, listening to the sounds of the night, the distant movement of wind through the trees, the occasional creak of wood, the breathing of those around her. And beneath all of it, she listened to her own thoughts, forming slowly, carefully, with a clarity that left no room for doubt. What had been done could not be undone, but what happened next was still unwritten. And Eliza was no longer willing to let someone else write it. The morning came like any other, but nothing was the same. The sun rose over the plantation, casting its usual light across the fields, calling everyone back into motion as if the world had not shifted during the night. Eliza stepped outside with the others, her face calm, her movements steady, her eyes lowered just enough to avoid attention. To anyone watching, she looked unchanged. Another worker returning to the same routine, another woman carrying the same quiet endurance. But inside, something had settled into place with a clarity that would not fade. She had crossed a line within herself, one that separated survival from something else entirely. Something that could not be undone. Lila remained inside the cabin that morning, too shaken to join the others. Eliza had arranged for an older woman to stay with her, someone she trusted, someone who understood without needing to ask questions. Before leaving, Eliza had knelt beside her daughter, placing both hands gently on her face, speaking in a voice that carried both softness and certainty. She told her she was not alone. She told her she would be protected. And though she did not say exactly how, there was something in her tone that made Lila believe her. That belief mattered. It was the only thing Eliza could give in that moment that held any immediate strength. In the fields, the rhythm of work continued, but Eliza's awareness had sharpened. She watched everything. Not openly, not in a way that would draw attention, but quietly, carefully, the way she had learned to survive all these years. She noted the movements of the master, when he appeared, when he left, who followed him, who avoided him. She listened to conversations, to the small details others might overlook. She had spent years understanding how the plantation worked, how power moved through it, how patterns formed and repeated. Now that knowledge began to take on a different purpose. It was no longer just for endurance. It was for something else, something precise. The master carried on as he always had, unaware that anything had changed. That was his greatest weakness. He believed himself untouchable. He believed that what he had done would remain buried beneath the silence he had enforced for so long. He moved through the plantation with the same careless authority, speaking loudly, giving orders, expecting obedience without question. To him, Eliza was invisible, and that invisibility, once a shield for survival, became something far more powerful. It allowed her to move without being seen, to think without being suspected, to plan without interruption. That evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the land, Eliza returned to the cabin. Lila sat quietly, her body still tense, her eyes searching her mother's face for something she could not fully name. Eliza sat beside her again, her presence steady, her voice calm. She spoke not of what had happened, but of what would come next. She told her daughter to stay close, to remain with those she trusted, to avoid being alone whenever possible. These were instructions shaped by experience, but now they carried urgency. Lila listened, nodding slowly, holding on to every word as if it were something she could stand on. That night, the plantation settled once more into darkness. But unlike the night before, Eliza did not sit still. She moved. She stepped outside quietly, her feet making almost no sound against the ground. The air was warm, the sky clear, the stars faint but visible above the wide stretch of land. She walked not toward the fields, but toward the larger house where the master stayed. Each step was measured, each movement controlled. She had thought through this moment, not in anger but in clarity. This was not an act of impulse. It was a decision shaped by everything she had endured, everything she had protected, everything that had been taken without consequence. She reached the edge of the house and paused, listening. The faint glow of light showed through one of the windows. Inside there was movement, the sound of a chair, the soft clink of glass. He was awake. Eliza moved along the side of the building, keeping to the shadows, her body close to the wall. She knew this place. She had worked near it before. She knew where the doors were, where the steps creaked, where the ground remained quiet. She reached the back entrance and placed her hand against the wood, feeling its surface, steadying herself for a moment that carried no return. Inside, the master sat alone, unaware that anything had shifted beyond his control. Outside, Eliza took one slow breath, and then she opened the door. The door opened without a sound, just enough to let her slip inside. The room was dim, lit by a single lamp resting on a wooden table. The master sat with his back partially turned, a glass in his hand, his posture relaxed, unaware that anything had changed. For a moment, Eliza stood still, just inside the doorway, her eyes adjusting to the light, her breathing steady, controlled. This was the closest she had ever been to him outside of labor, outside of command. This was not a place she was meant to enter without permission. But that world no longer held authority over what she had come to do. He noticed her only when she had already taken a step forward. At first, confusion crossed his face, then irritation. He demanded to know why she was there, his voice sharp, accustomed to obedience. He did not rise immediately. He did not sense danger. To him, she was still what she had always been, someone beneath him, someone who would explain, apologize, retreat. But Eliza did not speak. She did not lower her head. She did not move back. She stepped forward again, and something in her silence began to change the air in the room. He stood then, slower now, his expression shifting as he tried to understand what he was seeing. There was something different in her posture, in the way she held herself, in the way her eyes met his without hesitation. He took a step toward her, his voice rising, attempting to reassert control, to push her back into the place he believed she belonged. But control depends on expectation, and in that moment, his expectations no longer applied. Eliza spoke. Her voice was low, steady, and clear in a way that carried more weight than shouting ever could. She did not speak long. She did not repeat herself. She said only what needed to be said, that he had crossed a line that could not be crossed, that what he had done would not be buried in silence, that she was no longer afraid of him. For the first time, he hesitated. It was brief, almost unnoticeable, but it was there, a crack in certainty, a moment where control did not return immediately. And in that moment, Eliza moved. The struggle that followed was not loud in the way one might expect. It was sudden, close, contained within the walls of the room. The chair fell back. The lamp flickered. The glass shattered against the floor. He tried to push back, to overpower, to regain the advantage he had always relied on. But this was not the same kind of encounter he had controlled before. This was not built on fear. This was built on decision. Eliza did not hesitate. Everything she had carried, every moment of silence, every act of endurance, every instinct to protect her child, moved with her in that space. It was not chaos. It was focused. It was final. When it ended, the room fell into a stillness that felt heavier than the night outside. Eliza stood there for a moment, her breathing steadying, her eyes fixed, her body unmoving. The reality of what had just happened settled slowly, not as shock, but as understanding. There was no turning back. There was no undoing this moment. But there was also no regret. She turned and walked to the door, opening it as quietly as she had entered. Outside, the night remained unchanged. The air was still. The stars remained distant. The plantation slept, unaware that something had just shifted in a way it would never fully recover from. Eliza moved back toward the cabins, her steps measured, her expression returning to the calm she had always carried. But it was no longer the same calm. It was something deeper, something resolved. Inside the cabin, Lila lay resting, unaware that the world beyond her had already begun to change. Eliza sat beside her once more, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. And for the first time since the night before, she allowed herself to close her eyes. Morning did not arrive gently that day. It broke over the plantation like something unsettled, as if the land itself sensed that something had shifted during the night. The usual rhythm began, as it always did, with movement from the cabins, quiet footsteps in the dirt, the distant sounds of animals stirring awake. But beneath that routine, something was off. There was a delay, a hesitation. The master had not appeared. At first, no one spoke of it. Absence in a place like that was often noticed before it was acknowledged. Workers glanced toward the large house, expecting at any moment to see a figure step out, to hear a voice call orders, to feel the familiar weight of control settle into place. But the door remained closed. The windows stayed still, And slowly, quietly, the absence began to grow into something that could no longer be ignored. One of the house servants was the first to approach. She moved carefully, her steps cautious, her eyes scanning the area as if expecting to be stopped before she reached the door. When no one did, she knocked softly. There was no answer. She waited, then knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. The silence inside the house felt different from the silence of sleep. It felt heavy. After a moment of hesitation, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. What she saw made her stop immediately. The stillness, the overturned chair, the broken glass scattered across the floor. And at the center of it all, the reality that could not be undone. Her breath caught in her throat, not in a scream, but in a sharp intake of shock that held her in place. For a long second, she did not move. Then she turned and ran. The news spread quickly, but not loudly. It moved in low voices, in urgent whispers, carried from one person to another with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The master was gone, not missing, not absent. Gone in a way that left no confusion. The plantation did not erupt into chaos. It shifted into something quieter, something more tense. The overseer was called. Other white men from nearby land arrived before long, their movements sharp, their voices controlled but strained. They entered the house, remained inside for some time, then emerged with expressions that confirmed what no one had yet said aloud in full. Something had happened that broke the order they relied on. Something had come from within the system, not from outside it, and that made it far more dangerous. The workers were gathered, not roughly, but firmly. Questions began, one by one, directed at those who had been near the house. Those who might have seen something, heard something, noticed something out of place. The answers came carefully. No one knew. No one had seen anything. The night had been quiet. The same answer repeated in different voices, in different ways, until it became a wall that could not be easily broken. But suspicion did not disappear. It shifted. It moved through the crowd, searching for a place to settle. Eyes looked more closely now. Movements were watched more carefully. The overseer paced slowly, his mind working through possibilities, his control no longer as certain as it had been the day before. Through all of this, Eliza remained where she always was, among the others, quiet, steady. Her posture unchanged, her expression calm in a way that revealed nothing. She answered when spoken to, her voice even, her words simple. She had slept. She had heard nothing. She had seen nothing, and there was nothing in her tone, nothing in her face that gave reason to question her further. Years of survival had taught her how to exist without drawing attention, how to speak without revealing, how to move through moments of danger without becoming part of them. But beneath that stillness, something had changed. The fear that once guided her every action was no longer in control. It had been replaced by something quieter, but stronger. Resolve. As the day stretched on, tensions settled deeper into the plantation. Work did not stop, but it moved differently, slower, more watchful. The overseer remained present in a way he had not before, his eyes scanning constantly, his voice sharper when giving orders, as if trying to reestablish control through force of presence alone. But control is not only about what is seen, it is about what is believed. And belief had been shaken. The idea that the master could be touched, could be reached, could be brought down from the position he had held for so long, had already begun to spread, even if no one spoke it aloud. By late afternoon, riders had been sent to nearby towns. The law would come, questions would deepen, pressure would increase. Eliza understood this without needing to hear it directly. What she had done had not ended the system. It had not broken the structure that surrounded them. But it had done something that could not be undone. It had shown that there were limits to what power could protect. And once that truth exists, it does not disappear. That evening, as the sun lowered and shadows returned to their place across the land, Eliza sat once more beside Lila. The girl looked at her differently now, not with fear, but with a quiet search for understanding. She did not know everything that had happened, but she knew enough to feel that something had changed. Eliza placed her hand gently over hers, her voice soft but steady as she spoke. She told her that some things cannot be allowed to continue, that some lines, once crossed, must be answered. She did not speak of revenge. She spoke of protection, of dignity, of a mother's duty to stand when silence is no longer enough. Outside, the plantation prepared for a night that would not pass as easily as the last. Men kept watch. Voices stayed lower than usual. The air carried a tension that could not be ignored. And somewhere within that tension, the truth settled quietly into place. Eliza had changed something. Not loudly, not publicly, but permanently. The law arrived just after sunrise, carried in on horseback with the weight of authority and the expectation of answers. Two men led the approach, their presence sharp and deliberate, followed by another who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone used to being obeyed without question. They did not rush. They did not need to. The plantation waited for them, already unsettled, already stretched thin by uncertainty. As they dismounted near the main house, their eyes moved across the land, taking in the people, the buildings, the silence that seemed to linger in every corner. They stepped inside the house without speaking much to those gathered outside, and for a time the only sign of their work was the slow passing of shadows across the windows. When they emerged, their expressions were set, not surprised, but confirmed. The questions began again, but this time they carried more weight. The overseer stood beside them, answering first, recounting what had been found, what had not been seen, what could not yet be explained. Then the attention turned outward. One by one, workers were called forward, their names spoken, their presence required. The process was slow, methodical, and designed to wear down certainty. The same questions were asked in different ways. Where were you? What did you hear? Who did you see? The answers came steady, careful, unchanged. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything unusual. The night had been quiet. Eliza waited her turn without movement, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her breathing even, her gaze lowered just enough to appear compliant without drawing notice. When her name was called, she stepped forward with the same calm she had carried through every other moment. The man questioning her studied her closely, his eyes searching for hesitation, for inconsistency, for anything that might suggest more than her words revealed. He asked where she had been. She answered. He asked if she had heard any disturbance. She answered. He asked if she had reason to believe anyone on the plantation would act against the master. She paused for only a fraction of a second, just long enough to seem thoughtful, then said no. Her voice did not waver. Her posture did not shift. And whatever he expected to find in her, he did not find it. The questioning continued through the morning and into the afternoon. But the result did not change. There was no clear answer, no witness, no evidence that could be turned into certainty. The lawmen grew quieter as the hours passed, their frustration settling beneath their control. They walked the grounds again, spoke among themselves in low tones, then returned to the house once more. The plantation held its breath, waiting for something that would break the tension, but nothing came. Only the weight of not knowing. Among the workers, something else had begun to take shape. It was not spoken openly, not even in whispers that carried far, but it existed in the way people looked at one another, in the way silence felt different now. The fear that had once been constant had shifted. It had not disappeared, but it had changed form. There was a new awareness, a quiet understanding that something had happened that could not be undone. The system still stood. The rules still applied. But something within it had been touched in a way that could not be fully controlled. Eliza felt that shift, though she did not show it. She moved through the day as she always had, working when required, speaking when necessary, remaining part of the routine that defined the plantation. But inside, her thoughts remained steady, grounded in the decisions she had already made. She did not look for signs of success. She did not search for validation. What had been done was not for recognition. It was for something deeper, something that did not require anyone else to understand it. As evening approached, the lawmen prepared to leave. They spoke briefly with the overseer, their voices low but firm, making it clear that the matter was not closed, only unresolved. They would return if needed. They would continue to look for answers. But for now, they had none. They mounted their horses and rode away, leaving behind a plantation that felt changed in ways that could not be easily measured. That night, the air carried a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of something unsettled, something that had shifted and could not be returned to its previous place. The overseer remained alert, his presence more constant than before, his authority now carried with a hint of uncertainty. The workers moved carefully, aware that attention still lingered, that danger had not passed completely. But beneath all of it, there was something else. Something small, but real. Eliza sat beside Lila once more, the dim light of the cabin casting soft shadows across the walls. Her daughter leaned against her, her body no longer trembling in the same way, her breathing steadier than it had been before. Eliza placed her hand gently over hers, not speaking for a long moment. Then quietly she told her that the world does not always give justice, that sometimes people must take it for themselves in the only way they can. Lila did not fully understand, not yet, but she listened, holding onto the sound of her mother's voice, the steadiness of it, the strength within it. Outside, the plantation continued, as it always would. Work would resume, orders would be given. Life would move forward under the same structure that had always existed. But something had been altered beneath the surface. A line had been crossed. A boundary had been challenged. And even if no one spoke it aloud, the truth remained. Eliza had done what the system believed no one would ever dare to do. And in doing so, she had changed more than just one life. She had changed what was possible. The plantation did not return to what it had been, no matter how much those in control tried to force it back into place. On the surface, the routines continued. The fields filled with movement at sunrise. The overseer gave orders with a sharper edge, and the structure of power remained visible in every direction. But something beneath that structure had shifted in a way that could not be undone. It lived in the silence between words, in the way people looked at one another, in the understanding that had taken root without needing to be spoken. The absence of the master was not just a change in leadership. It was a crack in certainty, and cracks, once formed, do not simply disappear. The overseer attempted to fill the space with control, increasing his presence, watching more closely, speaking more often, and as if authority could be restored through volume and attention alone. But authority depends on belief, and belief had changed. The workers still moved, still obeyed, still followed the patterns required of them. But the fear that had once guided every action no longer held the same shape. It was not gone, but it had been challenged. The idea that power was absolute had been broken, even if only in one place, even if only in one moment. And that idea began to move quietly through the plantation, carried not in words, but in awareness. Among the cabins, conversations remained careful, but they carried new weight. People did not ask direct questions. They did not speak openly about what had happened, but they understood that something had. The absence of evidence did not erase the presence of truth, and that truth began to settle into the way people thought, the way they held themselves, the way they looked at the world around them. It was not loud. It was not defiant in the way stories often describe resistance. It was something quieter, something steady, a shift in what people believed was possible. Eliza continued her life as she always had, but even she could feel the difference, not in how others treated her openly, but in the subtle changes that passed between people. A glance held a fraction longer. A nod carried a deeper meaning. A moment of silence felt less like fear and more like understanding. No one approached her with questions. No one spoke her name in connection to what had happened. But she sensed that some knew, or at least suspected. And more importantly, they chose silence not out of fear, but out of respect. The kind of respect that comes from recognizing something that cannot be said aloud. Lila began to change as well. The fear that had once settled into her movements slowly began to loosen its grip. She still moved carefully, still listened closely, but there was something new in her posture, something that had not been there before. Strength, quiet but present. She stayed close to her mother, learning not just from what was said, but from what was done, from the way Eliza carried herself, from the calm that remained even after everything that had happened. That calm was not the same as before. It was no longer just survival. It was something deeper, something rooted in decision. Beyond the plantation, the story began to move. Not as a clear account, not with names or details that could be traced, but as something carried in fragments. A master gone. No explanation. No witness. Just absence where there had once been control. Travelers spoke of it in low tones. Workers on neighboring land heard pieces of it, passed from one person to another, each telling shaped by caution, by distance, by the need to remain unseen. Some dismissed it as rumor. Others listened more closely, sensing that something within it carried truth. In those quiet tellings, the meaning of the story began to grow. It was not just about what had happened. It was about what it represented. A moment where silence did not hold. A moment where someone had acted. A moment where the expected outcome had been changed. That meaning traveled further than the details ever could. It reached people who had never seen the plantation, who had never known Eliza or Lila, but who understood the weight of living under a system that allowed such things to happen without consequence. The law did not return immediately. The investigation remained open in word, but without direction, without evidence. It began to fade into something less urgent. Other matters took priority, but other problems demanded attention. The plantation remained under watch, but not under the same pressure as before. The moment had passed, at least in the eyes of those who sought to control it. But for those who had lived within it, the moment remained. Eliza did not look for recognition. She did not expect change to come quickly or completely. She understood the world she lived in too well to believe that one act could undo it. But she also understood something else. That change does not always begin with something large. Sometimes it begins with a single decision, a line drawn, a refusal to accept what has always been accepted. And once that line is drawn, it exists, whether or not the world chooses to see it. One evening, as the sun lowered and the land settled into quiet once more, Eliza sat outside the cabin with Lila beside her. The air was warm, the sky fading into deep color, the sounds of the day slowly giving way to the stillness of night. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Lila turned slightly, her voice soft, asking a question she had held inside for days. "Are we safe now?" Eliza did not answer immediately. She looked out across the land, across the fields that still held the same shape, the same structure, the same weight. Then she looked back at her daughter, her expression steady, her voice calm. Safer than before. It was not a promise. It was not certainty. But it was truth. And sometimes truth is the strongest thing a person can hold on to. Time moved forward, but it did not erase what had happened. It carried it, quietly, steadily, shaping it into something that lived beyond the moment itself. The plantation remained, the fields continued to stretch beneath the sun, and the system that controlled so many lives did not suddenly collapse. But something within it had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The absence of the master became part of the land's memory, something that lingered even as others stepped in to fill the space he once occupied. New authority arrived, new rules were reinforced, but the certainty that had once defined that place never fully returned. There was always something beneath it now, something unspoken, something remembered. Among the people, that memory did not fade. It settled into the way they carried themselves, into the way they understood the world around them. They still worked, still followed the patterns required of them, but they were no longer exactly the same. They had seen something different. Not openly, not in a way that could be pointed to or explained, but they had felt it. A moment where the expected order had been broken. A moment where someone had acted in a way the system did not allow for. And once that possibility exists, it does not disappear. It becomes part of how people think, how they endure, how they imagine what could be different. Eliza did not become a figure spoken about in stories with her name attached. She remained who she had always been in the eyes of those in power. Another worker, another woman moving quietly through the days. But within the community around her, Something deeper had taken root. Not admiration in a loud or visible way, but recognition. The kind that does not need to be spoken to be understood. People knew or believed or felt enough to carry the truth in silence. In that silence, once a tool of fear became something else. It became protection. It became respect. Lila grew under that quiet shift. The fear that had once shaped her began to loosen, replaced slowly by awareness, by strength that came not from forgetting what had happened, but from understanding that it had been answered. She listened to her mother not only for guidance, but for meaning. The lessons Eliza gave were not always direct. They lived in small things, in how to watch without being seen, in how to move without drawing attention, in how to know when silence protects and when it must be broken. These were not just survival skills. They were something more. They were a way of holding on to dignity in a world that tried to take it. As years passed, the story of what had happened continued to move, not as a clear narrative, not with names or dates or details that could be written down, but as something carried in pieces. A place where power had been challenged. A moment where silence had not held. A reminder that even in the most controlled environments, there were still lines that could be drawn. That understanding reached beyond one plantation, beyond one group of people, beyond one moment in time. It became part of a larger truth that existed wherever people were forced to endure more than they should have. Eliza lived her life without ever seeking to be remembered for what she had done. That was never the purpose. She did not act for recognition. She acted because there was no other path she could accept. Because there are moments when survival alone is not enough. When something inside refuses to allow what has been done to remain unanswered. And in those moments, decisions are made that shape everything that follows, even if the world never fully sees them. One evening, many years later, as the light of the setting sun stretched across the land, Eliza sat once more beside her daughter, who was no longer a child. The world had changed in ways both small and large, but the weight of the past remained part of who they were. They did not speak often about that night. They did not need to. It lived in their understanding, in the bond between them, in the quiet strength they carried. Lila looked out across the fields, then back at her mother, her voice calm, her questions simple. Did it matter? Eliza took her time before answering, not because she did not know, but because the truth deserved to be given with care. She looked at her daughter, really looked, seeing not just who she was, but who she had become. Yes, that was all she said. Because sometimes a single word carries everything that needs to be understood. The story of the enslaved mother who refused to remain silent was never written in official records. It was never taught in places where history was shaped by power. But it lived on, carried in memory, in quiet voices, in the understanding passed from one generation to the next. That there are moments when fear must be faced, when silence must be broken, when a line must be drawn, and when it is, the world, no matter how powerful it seems, is never quite the same again. Thank you for watching Shadows of Black History. If this story moved you, remember to subscribe and like the channel so more hidden stories from the past can be told. And always remember, history is not only written by those who held power, it is carried by those who found the courage to stand against it, even when no one was watching.